Hello, everyone. My name is Markus Faltermeyer, and I work for the America House here, and I have the honor of hosting our tonight's event on Big Sky Country, a lecture with Callan. Thanks for being with us here in the auditorium at the America House. Thanks for being with us on your screens at home. I believe it's going to be a really interesting and a really exciting evening, and I hope you have a great time. Before we start our event, I want to introduce to you our moderation, our chair for tonight's Lesung, for tonight's lecture, and I also want to go through some regulations on how you can ask questions and so on. So first of all, let me introduce our chair for tonight's session, Georgia Tomasi. She teaches North American literature at the LMU Munich. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Ca' Foscari University in Venice, Italy, and her research interests include 21st century North American literature, and she has a focus on space, home, and displacement and inequality, which I really like because I also worked a lot on inequality studies. So thanks for being here, and thanks for being our host for this evening. Before I hand the word over to Georgia, let me just indicate real quickly how you can ask questions to either Georgia or our author tonight. Because of COVID, we discourage you from asking questions live via microphone because a microphone isn't just very hygienic. So please use your cell phone, and I'm not sure if you realize that if you enter the auditorium, you'll find a QR code which leads you to Slido, which is an app where you can type in your questions. If you have used the QR code, you don't need to do anything else. If you didn't have the chance to use the QR code, or if you are at home, you can just enter sli.do in your browser, and then write America House as hashtag into the field that is optional for you, and then you'll be forwarded to our event page for tonight. So if you want to ask a question, use Slido, and we will forward the question to our moderator for tonight. Basically, I wish you all a very interesting evening tonight, and I welcome Callan as well, and Jakob say it again. Immer. Sorry, I always kind of like forget the names. I'm sorry, I'm bad with that. So have a great evening with everyone on stage and everyone who is part via our live stream, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Markus, and a warm welcome from me as well. Welcome to our audience here in the theater, and welcome to our audience online. And thank you, Jakob Immervoll, so much for being here with us. Jakob is an actor and member of the Munich Volkstheater Ensemble, and he will read for us from the German edition of August called Big Sky Country, which came out early this year by Suhrkamp Verlag, translated by Hannes Meyer. Welcome, Jakob. And of course, I'm very excited to be joined virtually from California by Callan. Welcome, Callan, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for having me. Apologize for the mask here, but I'm in a public library, so I can't. Apparently they're making me wear it, even though I'm in a room by myself. But that's how it goes.
That's fine, and we can hear you just fine.
Okay, good.
So August is the story of this young boy who's about 12 years old when the novel begins. August grows up in Michigan on his father's dairy farm, but after his parents separate, he follows his mother first to Grand Rapids and then to Livingston, Montana, where his mother has found a job at a new local library. Here, August goes to school, he plays football, he has his first heartbreak, and he is part of a terribly violent event, which is kind of the turning point for his life and for the book itself. August is friendless, he's not really interested in going to college, and so he decides to leave and eventually ends up on a ranch near Martinsdale, a rural town north of Livingston, where he has found a job. at this range. So first of all, Callan, congratulations for this wonderful novel. I'm really excited to discuss it with you and to know more about it. So let me start by asking you, I think I want to start with the story Breatharians that was included in your collection, Dog Run Moon, which came out, a collection of short stories which came out in 2016. Because that story ended up being part of the novel of August's first chapter. So can you tell us a little bit about how the story originated, how you transitioned between short story and novel, and what was in that story that had the potential of becoming the great novel that I think August is?
Yeah, I think the genesis of that particular story, it was early in my writing career. Definitely, I was writing poetry at the time, and I remember not very good poetry, I might add, but I remember I was probably in my early 20s, and undergraduate actually, in college, and I wrote a poem, and one of the images was this, seeing this cat, dead in a barn. Very much something I saw as a child. I had a friend who grew up on a dairy farm, and I would always go to his house on the weekends, and we would, play in the barn and things like that. Anyway, this dead cat, like in a pile of manure, that his father was going to spread on the fields later. And so for some reason that image just was always in my head. And from the poem, I then wrote the short story. And then eventually from the short story, I wrote the novel. I don't know if that's how it goes for other writers, but I feel like you have a certain amount of material, and it's like a compulsion. You come back to it in whatever form you're working on, at least how it was in this case. I ended up writing 4 or 5 short stories after this one that had the same character, August. And then I guess it ended up being a novel, although that wasn't my intention from the beginning.
Mm. Were there any challenges in writing in long form as opposed to short stories?
Yeah, definitely. It's something I still struggle with. I don't think I'm a natural born novelist. I like, I have a rather short attention span sometimes when it comes to writing, and I feel like with a short story, it's not such a commitment. I can write one in a fairly short amount of time. There's a lot of beginning, there's a lot of ending. Novels just have this huge expansive middle, which I don't often know what to do with. From a publishing standpoint, quite honestly, I wish I was better at novels, because that's what publishers want, it seems like. But I enjoy writing short stories. But actually, I enjoy reading novels more. So as a writer, continues to be a challenge for me to create the form that I enjoy reading the most, even if it's not the form I like writing the most, if that makes sense.
Well, for being your debut novel, Callan, I think you did a pretty good job. I'm sure our audience is eager to hear you reading from August. So if that's okay with you, may I ask you to please read the first excerpt that we selected for tonight. And for those of you who still haven't read the book, these are the first couple of pages of chapter 1. After the novel's intro, we will listen to you read, Callan, and then Jakob will read from the German edition, and then, we'll talk about it.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just start. August's first fully accessible memory was of the barn. Riding on his parents' shoulders down the hill behind the house, he could see the building ahead of them, its peaked roof and the long, low addition off to the side, faded red with white trim. His father ducking under the door so he wouldn't hit his head, the dull murmur of the milk pump, the cows chewing in the stanchions. Maybe 5 or 6, he was too old to be riding on his father's shoulders, and he didn't want to be there. As soon as he could, he squirmed down and climbed to the haymow. The rungs of the ladder were almost too far spaced, but his father was there at his back in case he slipped. In the haymow, dusty and dark and warm, his father broke up 2 bales to make a soft pile, and they had several wrestling matches during which August got repeatedly tossed into the loose hay, a situation he loved more than just about anything. After a time, they descended the ladder, and August's father removed and sanitized the milkers, while August went around patting each Holstein on the nose. When the milking was done, August helped his father dip the teats of several cows until August dropped the applicator and spilled the iodine solution, and his father sat him in the milk room with a mason jar filled fresh from the refrigerator vat to keep him occupied while he finished the chores alone. The milk was full fat, thick and heavy, cold enough to fog the glass. There was a smell of the cows and straw. The milk room was whitewashed, cobwebs in the old wooden crossbeams, the stainless vat spotless and gleaming. He held the mason jar with both hands, drinking, the milk running down his chin. Eventually his father came and scooped him up. The cows had been put out to pasture, and the barn was silent. He rode on his father's shoulders back to the house, tired and not protesting now. His mother was at the kitchen table, a dim gray haze of smoke above her head. She had books scattered around her, glasses on, taking notes. He crawled up on her lap, and she wrinkled her nose, removing some of the papers from under one of his grubby hands. The sound of the TV being switched on came from the other room, his father opening a beer. She closed her books and put them into her backpack. "Looks like study hall is over," she said. "Thanks, Dad. Let's get you to the bath." August was 12, and there were cats in the barn. Litters begetting litters begetting litters, some thin and misshapen with the afflictions of blood too many times remixed. "Get rid of the damn things," August's father said. "The haymow smells like piss. Take a tire iron or a shovel or whatever tool suits you. You've been after me for school money? I'll give you $1 a tail. You have your jackknife? You have it sharp? You take their tails and pound them to a board, and then after a few days we'll have a settling up. Small tails worth as much as large tails. It's all the same." The cats, calicos, tabbies, dirty white, gray, jet black, and tawny, sat among the hay bales, scratching and yawning like indolent apes inhabiting the remains of a ruined temple. August had never actually killed a cat before, but like most farm boys, he had engaged in plenty of casual acts of torture. Cats, as a species, retained a feral edge, and as a result were not subject to the rules of husbandry that governed man's relations with horses or cows or dogs. August figured that somewhere along the lines, cats had struck a bargain. They knew they could expect to feel a man's boot if they came too close. In return, they kept their freedom, and nothing much was expected of them. $1 a tail. August thought of the severed appendages, pressed and dried, stacking up like currency in the teller drawer of some alien bank. $50 at least, maybe 75, possibly even 100 if he were able to track down the newborn litters. He went to the equipment shed to look for weapons. It was a massive structure, made of metal posts skinned with corrugated sheet metal, large enough to fit a full-size diesel combine. August liked to go there when it rained. It was like being a small creature deep in the bowels of a percussion instrument. The fat drops of rain would hit the thin metal skin in an infinite drum roll, punctuated by the clash of lightning cymbals and the hollow booming of space. In the shed, there was a long workbench covered in the tangled intestines of machinery, looping coils of compressor hoses, hydraulic arms leaking viscous fluid, batteries squat and heavy, baling twine like ligaments stitching the whole crazy mess together, tongue and ball trailer knobs, mason jars of rusting bolts and nuts and screws, a medieval-looking welder's mask, and interspersed among the other wreckage like crumpled birds, soiled leather gloves, and varying degrees of decomposition. August picked up a short length of rusted, heavy-linked logging chain and swung it a few times, experimentally, before discarding it. He put on a pair of too large gloves and hefted a broadsword-sized mower blade, slicing slow patterns in the air before discarding it, too. Then he uncovered a 3-foot-long breaker bar wrench with a slim stainless steel handle that swelled at the other end to a glistening and deadly crescent head. He brought the head down into his glove several times to hear the satisfying whack. He practiced a few death-dealing swing techniques, the sidearm golf follow-through, the overhead back-crushing axe chop, the short, quick line-drive baseball check swing, the wrench head making ragged divots in the hard-packed dirt floor. He worked up a light sweat and then shouldered his weapon, put the pair of gloves in his back pocket, and went to see his mother.
Thank you, Callan. We'll listen now to the German edition. Thank you, Jakob.
Augusts erste Erinnerung, auf die er richtig zugreifen konnte, drehte sich um die Scheune. Er sitzt bei seinem Vater auf den Schultern. Und als sie den Hang hinter dem Haus herunterkommen, sieht er das Gebäude vor sich, das Spitzdach und die langen, niedrigen Anbauten, alles in verblasstem Rot mit weißen Tür- und Fensterrahmen. An der Tür duckt sein Vater sich, damit August sich nicht stößt. Die Milchpumpe grummelt dumpf vor sich hin, die Kühe kauen in ihren Ständen. Er war vielleicht 5, 6, eigentlich zu alt, um auf den Schultern getragen zu werden, und er wollte es auch nicht. Bei der ersten Gelegenheit wand er sich runter und kletterte hoch auf den Heuboden. Die Sprossen der Leiter waren fast zu weit auseinander, aber sein Vater passte hinter ihm auf, falls er abrutschte. Auf dem staubigen, dunklen, warmen Heuboden brach sein Vater 2 Ballen auf, in deren loses Heu er August immer wieder warf, als sie dann kämpften, was August fast mehr liebte als alles andere. Nach einiger Zeit stiegen sie wieder die Leiter hinunter und Augusts Vater löste und desinfizierte die Melkbecher, während August die Runde machte und jeder der Holsteinkühe die Schnauze streichelte. Nach dem Melken half August seinem Vater, die Zitzen einiger Kühe in Jodlösung zu tauchen, bis August den Dippbecher fallen ließ und sein Vater ihn mit einem frisch aus dem Kühlschrank befüllten Einmachglas in die Milchkammer setzte, während er die Arbeit allein beendete. Es war sämige, schwere Rohmilch, so kalt, dass das Glas beschlug. Es roch nach Kühen und Stroh. Die Milchkammer war weiß getüncht, in den alten Querbalken hingen Spinnweben, der Edelstahltank schimmerte blitzsauber. August hielt das Einmachglas beim Trinken mit beiden Händen und die Milch lief ihm am Kinn herunter. Irgendwann kam sein Vater wieder und hob ihn hoch. Die Kühe waren jetzt auf der Weide und der Stall verstummt. August ließ sich ohne Protest auf den Schultern zurück zum Haus tragen, denn er war jetzt müde. Mit einer blassgrauen Rauchwolke über dem Kopf saß seine Mutter am Küchentisch, um sie herum lagen Bücher verstreut, sie hatte ihre Brille auf und machte sich Notizen. Als er ihr auf den Schoß kletterte, rümpfte sie die Nase und zog die Blätter unter seiner dreckigen Hand weg. Von nebenan hörte man, wie der Fernseher anging und sein Vater sich ein Bier aufmachte. Sie schlug die Bücher zu und steckte sie in ihren Rucksack. »Dann ist die Lernzeit jetzt wohl vorbei«, sagte sie. »Na, vielen Dank, Dad, und du kommst jetzt lieber mal in die Wanne.« August war 12 und die Scheune war voller Katzen. Ein Wurf warf den nächsten. Manche der Tiere waren dürr und kränklich, weil das immer gleiche Blut zu oft vermischt worden war. »Die scheiß Viecher müssen weg«, sagte Augusts Vater. »Auf dem Heuboden stinkt's nach Pisse. Nimm dir einen Montierhebel oder eine Schaufel oder was du willst. Du quengelst doch immer nach Taschengeld. Ich gebe dir $1 pro Schwanz. Du hast doch dein Taschenmesser. Ist es schön scharf? Also du nimmst die Schwänze und nagelst sie an ein Brett und nach ein paar Tagen rechnen wir ab. Kleine sind genauso viel wert wie große, ganz egal. Die Katzen, dreifarbige, getigerte, weißgraue, graue, schwarze, rote, saßen zwischen den Heuballen, kratzten sich und gähnten wie träge Affen in alten Tempelruinen. August hatte zwar noch nie eine Katze getötet, aber wie den meisten Farmjungs war ihm die Tierquälerei nicht fremd. Katzen als Spezies hatten immer etwas Wildes an sich behalten und waren deshalb nicht auf denselben Haltungsregeln unterworfen wie Pferde, Kühe und Hunde. August nahm an, dass die Katzen irgendwann eine Abmachung eingegangen waren. Sie wussten, dass sie den Stiefel spüren würden, wenn sie einem Menschen in die Quere kamen. Dafür behielten sie ihre Freiheit und man erwartete nicht viel von ihnen. $1 pro Stück. August stellte sich die abgeschnittenen Schwänze gepresst und getrocknet als Zahlungsmittel in der Kasse irgendeiner außerirdischen Bank vor. Mindestens $50, vielleicht 75 oder sogar 100, wenn er die ganz frischen Würfe fand. Er ging in die Maschinenhalle, um sich eine Waffe zu suchen. Ein riesiger Bau, groß genug für einen Dieselmähdrescher, ein Stahlstangengerippe mit einer Haut aus Wellblech. August war gern dort drinnen, wenn es regnete. Dann kam er sich vor wie ein kleines Tier im Inneren eines Schlaginstruments. Die dicken Regentropfen hämmerten einen endlosen Trommelwirbel auf das Blech, der gelegentlich vom Beckenkrachen der Blitze und dem hohlen Wummern der Weite unterbrochen wurde. In der Halle stand eine lange Werkbank voller verschlungener Maschineneingeweide, Kompressorschlauchspulen, Hydraulikarme, aus denen zähe Flüssigkeit leckte, kompakte, schwere Batterien, Pressengarn, das das wilde Chaos wie Gelenkband zusammenhielt, Kugelkopfkupplungen, Einmachgläser voller rostiger Bolzen, Muttern und Schrauben, ein mittelalterlich anmutender Schweißhelm und zwischen all den Trümmern lagen wie platte Vögel verstreut dreckige Lederhandschuhe in verschiedenen Verwesungsgraden. August hob eine kurze, rostige Forstkette mit schweren Gliedern auf, schwang sie ein paar Mal probeweise durch die Luft und legte sie wieder ab. Er zog 2 zu weite Handschuhe an und nahm sich ein säbelgroßes Meermesser, mit dem er langsam Muster in die Luft schnitt, bevor er es ebenso ablegte. Dann fand er einen knapp 1 Meter langen Hakenschlüssel, der einen schlanken Edelstahl griff und am Ende einen tödlich schimmernden Halbmondkopf hatte. Mit dem schlug er sich ein paar Mal in den Handschuh und hörte es satt klatschen. Er übte Schwungtechniken, den seitlichen Golfdurchschwung, den rückgratbrechenden Überkopf-Axthieb, den kurzen, schnellen Baseballschlag. Und der Schlüsselkopf trieb schroffe Dellen in den gestampften Lehmboden. August kam etwas in Schwitzen, schulterte schließlich seine Waffe, steckte sich die Handschuhe in die Gesäßtasche und ging dann seine Mutter besuchen.
Thank you both so much. Callan, I really love this opening. I think it's a great opening. So the book starts out with this memory of August and his father playing, and in a way it confirms this kind of idyllic, almost pastoral, image of rural life. And then you challenge that image almost right away with August's father asking him to kill the cats. And there's something that also strikes me about this passage. There's almost something sinister about this scene, right? August practicing his killer moves. And I think in a way, from the very beginning, this image of him practicing to kill the cats connects him to violence right away. And so I was going to ask you, I'm really curious to know more about violence in general in the book, but more specifically about how that is connected to growing up in rural parts of the Midwest and of the West. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think violence is definitely a part of this book. I feel like it's a part of I think the growing up, at least the sort of growing up that I had, and the places and the people I knew, which in part this book is concerned with. I think there's something about a person who grows up, you know, in an environment like this, a farm, for instance, that violence, especially violence towards animals, is kind of it's maybe not something that's as surprising as it would be to someone who maybe grew up with seeing like a cat as like a fluffy animal that you dress up in a sweater on Christmas or whatever. It's being around animals in this way that it's not, it's different. And anyway, as a young person, I guess, in this, it's not, there's nothing pathological, for instance, and at least I didn't think so, in August's attempts to eradicate the barn of cats. He's trying to complete a task that his father had asked him to do. So for me, anyway, in this particular kind of scenario, that, you know, killing of the cats, that sort of thing, what's more important or more interesting to me is how August is caught between his parents, and, you know, his father asking him to do this thing. While it's rather distasteful, I think probably what's most distasteful is how children get caught between parents who have, you know, maybe agendas of their own, and things like that. So I think probably more than anything I've ever written, the killing of the cats has created more. There's a lot of people that love cats in the world, put it that way. I actually love cats myself. So it's difficult to read. I realize that. I've gotten quite a bit of hate mail from this particular portion of the book. But I guess I return to the fact that, well, like, the world is a violent place. One, it's sad that cats get killed. It's also sad that kids get caught up in the world of adults and things that they don't understand, which for me, that's like a greater tragedy than some barn cats being killed, quite honestly. I've lost where I was at with that a little bit, but...
No, but I think that's really interesting, because another thing that struck me about that episode is that the father asking August to do that, it feels almost like a rite of passage. In a way, it really shaped one of the many, I should say, rites of passage in the book. But I had the sense that August's father and many other men in the book embody a very specific idea of masculinity that is kind of behind that, you know, that assumption that there has to be violence in growing up. And so August's mother, you were talking about the relationship between the two and him being caught in the middle, is obviously a very different presence in his life. But the father does have this, you know, idea of masculinity, of being, you know, hardworking and having a very physical relationship with nature. And so I was going to ask you, because I feel like August is really caught between these forces. Can you say something about that, about this idea of masculinity in the book? And does it have to do only with men, or does it have to do with the place in a way that August grows up in?
It's a good question. I think it is definitely both the place, and I think that, I mean, in part, with the book, I did want to look at just a particular form of masculinity. It is a mode that is, I think, rapidly becoming, you know, outdated in a lot of ways. I mean, probably the term toxic masculinity is thrown around a lot, and I don't know if I'm ready to launch into that right here. But in this particular place with these characters, I mean, for instance, yeah, August tasked with killing cats, kind of a rite of passage. Also, fast forward a few years to when he's in high school, thinking about his future. Um, you know, many of his friends, he as well. I mean, one of the best ways to progress in his world is to join the military, for instance. And so, you know, as people, for instance, maybe in more urban areas are horrified by a young boy killing some cats, they will have no qualms about voting to send young boys to war, you know, which is what happens to some of August's friends. So I think the world is a violent place still. And as of right now, a lot of young men, especially people I knew as a young person, went on to do that. And part of the book, you know, it's set kind of in that immediate aftermath of 9/11 as well as August becomes of age. There's just the specter of violence that is local in certain things that August does, but it's also a broader, you know, kind of more global, you know, situating him within a violent world, and where people he's close to end up going and dying in foreign countries. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, I would like to move on to another passage, because we just mentioned the mother, and I really loved that character. So the second passage is actually a very funny one, and it's the moment when Bonnie, August's mother, decides that she wants to move to Montana. Would you please read it for us, Callan?
His mother was always reading, and at this point, she still had hopes that the habit would rub off on him. She started bringing home books that featured fishing. He thought some of the Nick Adams stories were pretty good. Since they were set in Michigan, he could picture the cedar swamps, the clear cuts, and the colors of the brook trout. He made it through most of a river runs through it and thought it was okay, if a little fancy at times. She brought him Robert Traver and Tom McGuane and more Hemingway. While he occasionally sat on the couch with a book for a while to humor her, he knew that she didn't actually understand his relationship with fishing. The thing was, fishing wasn't something he thought about much when he wasn't actually doing it. He didn't have a great desire to learn new tactics or fish new places or read about it in metaphysical terms. Nick Adams fished to forget the parts of the war he carried back with him, and August thought that seemed about right. Standing on the banks of the Grand, watching a bobber ride a current seam was a magic trick. Fishing allowed him to disappear the city, his mother, his father, his friendless school existence. And while he needed it desperately, he also looked forward to a day when it would no longer be necessary for survival. At one point during his mother's fishing literature campaign, she brought home the movie A River Runs Through It. They watched it that night, eating wonton soup and pork buns, leaning over the coffee table so as not to spill on the couch. That Brad Pitt, his mother said, slurping her soup. Such a naughty grin he has. August decided it was a decent movie. He thought fly fishing in general was sort of melodramatic. He figured a person might be able to make a movie about bait fishermen, but there was no way they'd put Brad Pitt in it. God, his mother said, look at that scenery. Montana. That's not a place you ever really think of, is it? Oh wow, look at Brad Pitt wading across that river. The way he wears that creel across his chest is just perfect, isn't it? Mom, shut up so I can watch it, please. When the movie was over, he went to bed, but before he fell asleep, he heard the opening music drifting in from the living room. His mother had started the film all over again. In a million years, he never would have guessed that this strange stasis they'd found themselves in would eventually be broken by Brad Pitt, of all things. Something about Montana, the idea of it, seemed to stick in his mother's head. Now she read books about the Lewis and Clark expedition. She read Legends of the Fall by Jim Harrison, and she brought that movie home as well. It seemed like Brad Pitt had a monopoly on all Hollywood renditions of Montana. That Brad Pitt looks like he has a real firm hand on the reins of his horse, his mother said. I wonder if he can actually do it like that in real life. One day he came home from school to find his mother sitting on the couch. She hopped up when he walked through the door. She'd obviously been waiting for him, and he eyed her warily. She went to the kitchen to see if any of the leftovers in the fridge were edible. She followed him, leaning against the door jamb as he ate cold chicken salad from a carton. So, she said, I have some news. Yeah? I have a job interview in a couple weeks. What job? It's a brand new library. They just finished building it, and they're going to have 2 new positions available. Sounds good, he said. I'm sure you'll get it. Guess where? I don't know. Where? Bozeman, Montana. She raised her eyebrows. Big sky country. There was a brief pause, a forkful of chicken salad stalling en route to mouth before he recovered. He chewed, forked up another mound of chicken salad. Cool, he said, his mouth full. Later, he found an atlas and did a little research. State animal, grizzly bear. State bird, western meadowlark. State motto, oro y plata, gold and silver. There wasn't much to go off of, but still, the possibilities conjured far outstripped what he'd experienced in Michigan thus far.
Thank you.
Seine Mutter las andauernd und noch hoffte sie, dass diese Gewohnheit auf ihn abfärben würde. Sie brachte Bücher mit, in denen es ums Angeln ging. Die Nick Adams-Geschichten fand er ganz gut. Sie spielten in Michigan, also konnte er sich die Lebensbaumsümpfe, Rodungen und die Farben der Bachsaiblinge gut vorstellen. Er schaffte es fast ganz durch. Aus der Mitte entspringt ein Fluss. Fand das Buch okay, wenn auch ein bisschen melodramatisch abgehoben. Sie brachte ihm Robert Traver mit und Tom McGuane und noch mehr Hemingway. Und auch wenn er sich ab und zu mit einem Buch aufs Sofa setzte, damit sie sich freute, wusste er, dass sie seine Beziehung zum Angeln nicht so recht verstand. Eigentlich dachte er nämlich kaum ans Angeln, wenn er nicht gerade dabei war. Er hatte keine großen Ambitionen, neue Techniken zu lernen oder an neuen Orten zu angeln oder über metaphysische Aspekte der Sache zu lesen. Nick Adams angelte, um die Teile des Krieges zu vergessen, die er mit nach Hause gebracht hatte. Und das klang für August ganz richtig. Wenn er am Ufer des Grand River stand und die Pose beobachtete, wie sie an der Strömungsgrenze tänzelte, war das ein Zaubertrick. Beim Angeln konnte er verschwinden, der Stadt entfliehen, seiner Mutter, seinem Vater, seinem Schulleben ohne Freunde. Und auch wenn es absolut lebensnotwendig für ihn war, freute er sich doch auf eine Zukunft, in der er es nicht mehr brauchen würde. Irgendwann im Laufe der Angelliteraturkampagne seiner Mutter brachte sie den Film von Aus der Mitte entspringt ein Fluss mit. Sie schauten ihn am gleichen Abend und aßen dabei weit über den Couchtisch gebeugt Wantan-Suppe, damit sie die Polster nicht volltropften. Dieser Brad Pitt, sagte seine Mutter und schlürfte, was der für ein freches Grinsen hat. August fand den Film okay. Fliegen, Fischen, allgemein war ihm ein bisschen zu melodramatisch. Wahrscheinlich konnte man auch einen Film über Leute drehen, die ganz normal mit Köder angeln, aber dafür hätten sie niemals Brad Pitt genommen. Mein Gott, sagte seine Mutter, guck dir mal die Landschaft an. Montana. Die Gegend hat man sonst kaum auf dem Schirm, oder? Wow, jetzt wartet Brad Pitt durch den Fluss. Wie er den Fischkorb vor der Brust trägt, das ist doch einfach perfekt, oder? Mom, halt doch mal die Klappe, ich will den Film sehen, ja? Als der Film vorbei war, ging er ins Bett. Aber bevor er einschlafen konnte, hörte er wieder die Musik vom Vorspann aus dem Wohnzimmer. Seine Mutter hatte den Film gleich wieder von vorne angefangen. Nie im Leben wäre er darauf gekommen, dass dieser seltsame Schwebezustand, in dem sie sich befanden, ausgerechnet von Brad Pitt gebrochen werden würde. Irgendwas von Montana, dieser Vorstellung, blieb bei seiner Mutter hängen. Jetzt las sie Bücher über die Lewis- und Clark-Expedition, sie las Herbstlegenden von Jim Harrison und brachte auch den Film mit nach Hause. Anscheinend hatte Brad Pitt ein Monopol auf Hollywood-Darstellungen Montanas. Dieser Brad Pitt hat das Pferd ja wirklich gut im Griff, sagte Augusts Mutter. Ob er das in Wirklichkeit wohl auch so kann? Eines Tages kam er nach Hause und seine Mutter saß auf dem Sofa. Als sie ihn sah, sprang sie auf. Sie hatte offensichtlich auf ihn gewartet und er musterte sie misstrauisch. Er ging in die Küche und sah nach, ob von den Resten im Kühlschrank noch etwas essbar war. Sie folgte ihm und lehnte sich an den Türrahmen, während er kalten Hühnchensalat aus der Schachtel aß. Also, sagte sie, ich habe Neuigkeiten. Ja, ich habe in 2 Wochen ein Bewerbungsgespräch. Für was denn für einen Job? In einer ganz neuen Bibliothek, die haben sie gerade erst gebaut und es gibt 2 Stellen zu besetzen. Hört sich gut an, sagte er. Die nehmen dich bestimmt. Rate mal wo. Keine Ahnung, wo denn? Bozeman, Montana. Sie zog die Augenbrauen hoch. Big Sky Country. Es gab eine kurze Pause, als seine Gabel mit Hühnchensalat auf dem Weg zum Mund stockte, bis August sich wieder gefasst hatte. Er kaute, belud die Gabel wieder. Cool, sagte er mit vollem Mund. Später suchte er sich einen Atlas und recherchierte ein bisschen. Staatstier Grizzlybär, Staatsvogel westlicher Lerchensterling, Staatsmotto Oro y Plata, Gold und Silber. Das war noch nicht viel, aber die Möglichkeiten, die dabei anklangen, übertrafen doch bei weitem alles, was er bisher in Michigan erlebt hatte.
Thank you, Jakob. August's mother hopes to get him interested in literature by reading about fishing. And some of the books you mentioned, Callan, are actually set in Michigan, but you also reference this tradition of writers, of authors who write about Montana. And I was curious if these were also the authors that inspired you, if they were formative for you in any way. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, for whatever reason, Montana seems to have a decent literary tradition. You know, for instance, Jim Harrison was a friend of mine. I used to take him fishing before he died, but I also, you know, he grew up, was born and raised in Michigan. And so I think as a young person, I was drawn to his writing. Similarly, Tom McGuane, he was a Michigan person that found his way to Montana. I don't know if the way that these 2 individuals, McGuane and Harrison, write is an inspiration as much as like they're people I met and I knew who were able to make a life as a writer. I didn't know any writers growing up. I didn't spend time around writers, and seeing, for instance, these 2 men who were able to live in Montana. They didn't live in New York City, for instance, and they were able to make a living writing. That was inspirational to me when I met them in my early to mid 20s. Just seeing examples of writers living in the world and doing it on their terms, you know, not having, again, not feeling like they needed to live in Brooklyn to have a writing career.
In that passage, I had the sense that you also kind of engaged with the representation of the West and of Montana in the American imagination, also in the European imagination. I mean, Big Sky Country immediately echoes that that sense of fascination, you know, with that particular untamed, if you want, American landscape. One example is August's mother's fascination with Brad Pitt, but also the town of Livingston, where they end up moving, has that kind of Old West aura. And in general, you know, this stereotypical image of the American West as mythical, also a very masculine place, is something that we are confronted with in the book. But August doesn't seem to know too much about Montana from this passage, so much so that he has to go and Google or do a little bit of research, I guess. And so can you talk a little bit about this idea of the West as myth in the book, and about what you wanted August to kind of discover on his own?
Yeah, the Western myth is huge. I think anyone who's trying to write a novel set in the American West will have to confront, you know, their own understanding of the American myth, a lot of which I think was created by Hollywood, quite honestly. But you know, I think it's pretty common for people who are from other parts of the country to not really know much about Montana. It's changing, but it's up there kind of by Canada, you know, maybe has Yellowstone Park in it. And so, I mean, Montana is often lumped into this area, you know, flyover country. You're basically, you know, going over it or through it to get to somewhere more interesting. And these sorts of places are where I've spent the bulk of my life, and I feel like the people that live there have, of course, you know, uniquely interesting stories, and so I'm interested in that. And I think you know, kind of grappling with, there's this kind of thing of like the new West. I mean, the West in terms of population and things like that right now is undergoing, you know, a great amount of growth. People are sort of fleeing major urban areas because they maybe, you know, well, coronavirus is a big part of it, but so the West has all of these problems. You know, the water is going to be a big one, and just infrastructure. That's not prepared for this influx of people. This is a little outside of the book, but I guess where I'm getting at with all this is that, like, Montana, for instance, is rapidly becoming something other than just flyover country. And the growth and the change is going to run up against our ideas of the American West, which is just like wide open spaces and, you know, grizzly bears and things like that, which is all still there, but is also coming up against, you know, what happens when the grizzly bear has nowhere else to go, and it's, you know, mauling people when they're hiking, you know, things like that. So I've kind of gotten off on a tangent, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. And you mentioned conflict earlier, and I would like to go back to that for a second, because I was really interested in the relationship between men and women in this book. I think there's almost, I don't know, there's a kind of a dominant idea about women. I thought, you know, they're all kind of intellectuals. They seem to be a little bit fed up with life in the West, with rural life. Bonnie wants, you know, to have this job as a librarian. She studies to become a librarian. Julie moves to New York City. June goes to Brown. Whereas the men seem to be more rooted and more at ease in this place, in this kind of rural life that is, you know, which rhythm is kind of determined in a very organic way. And I was interested in that because, like you said earlier, August gets caught between these two parents who are so focused on or so caught up in their own life. This conflict is there since the very beginning when Darwin and Bonnie discuss August's name. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, about conflict, about if that has anything to do with place and with a place in particular that you describe in your book.
I mean, I think in August's case, you know, his mother does seem to occupy this role as she's someone who's probably a little more curious about the outside world, has had more experience in places other than small rural communities, and like, you know, most parents wants the best for her son, which maybe in this case does not mean taking over the family dairy farm in rural Michigan. So I think it's just a scenario where you know, both parents probably want the best thing for their child, but just what that looks like is so wildly different in this case. And the fact that August is caught between those two things, I mean, I think is pretty common, and it's not unusual. It's a fairly average sort of growing up scenario. One parent is you know, pushing for one thing, and one parent is pushing for the other thing. And I guess you know, this novel I would consider to be a coming of age novel, and the goal with it was to have this character August not necessarily adopt one or the other of his parents' sort of hopes for him, is to find his own way. And you know, I don't know if he's totally done that at the end of the novel, but he is at least, you know, on his way towards making some sort of life for himself. And what that looks like, you know, is who's to say? I don't think it needs to be this, you know, complete dichotomy between the life of culture and you know, urban possibilities versus maybe the wilderness in Montana, but some blending of both possibly.
Mm-hmm. Callan, I'm going to ask you to read one last passage, and this is from August's first weeks in Montana when he's riding his bike and he takes in the scenery, but he also has some quite deep reflections about who he is and who he wants to be.
Sure. August took up riding his bike aimlessly for hours. The roads out of town were lined with sunflowers just past their peak. He pedaled past legions of them, their heavy heads hanging from drying stalks, yellow but starting to fade to brown, petals gone here and there, giving them the look of gap-toothed mouths. One afternoon, he saw kids jumping from the railroad trestle bridge into the river, mostly boys around his age, in cut-off jean shorts, skinny and tan. There was one girl, though, in a yellow one-piece swimsuit. While August watched, she did a front flip, and just before hitting the water, heels first, back perfectly straight, she plugged her nose with her hand. A precise, almost delicate movement. She entered with barely a splash, and then bobbed up a short way downstream, arms flashing as she stroked against the current to shore. When she climbed the rocks to get back up to the bridge, her suit bunched in the rear, the pale flesh her suit normally covered bright in the sun. When she gained the trestled platform, she removed the offending wedgie with the heart-stopping reach and pull and wiggle that spread the suit back out. She was short, with blonde hair and a wet braid down her back. One of the boys said something to her that August couldn't make out, and then she pushed him off the trestle, laughing, before jumping again herself. August had ridden for miles in the late summer sun. His shirt was stuck to his back with sweat, and he knew a different, better version of himself would go and climb the trestle, introduce himself to the other guys, nod casually at the girl, strip off his shirt, and do a full gainer into a new life where he made friends easily. Instead, he kept riding. There was a pinch where the mountains on either side of the valley came down close to the river. We already noticed that the wind always blew here. The air funneled down and constricted by the ridges. He ducked his head and pedaled hard, airborne grit peppering his cheeks until he came through and the valley opened before him. Open expanses of pasture land and hayfields still green from late summer irrigation water pulled from the river. Not a dairy cow to be seen anywhere. It was all red or black Angus here, standing dumb, heads lowered to the grass, sometimes coming to the fence, but bolting back wall-eyed when his bike came too close. This sort of operation had a certain degree of dignity not found in the milking parlor. These cattle had never felt a stanchion around their necks, had never stood immobile and shitting while a machine sucked away at their teats. They lived a life, short though it may be, out in the elements, free to range, largely unharassed, until, of course, the moment arrived at which they were loaded up in trucks bound for slaughter. A long, monotonous life, full of swollen udders and indignity, or a shorter life of relative freedom, albeit one with a certain amount of inevitable terror and confusion preceding death. It was something to think about. Cows weren't people, of course, but August knew that a guy like Bob, he'd be jumping from that trestle right now instead of sitting out here alone, straddling his bike, watching a field full of stupid cattle. He'd have met the yellow swimsuit girl. He'd have fought once or twice, and then the rest of the guys would have been his friends. The thing that made him stab Brant Gidley and got him sent away was the same thing that gathered him respect and fear and friendship and qualities much greater than August had ever enjoyed. August was trying to figure out whether this quality, whatever it was exactly, was something a person was born with or something one developed. One thing he knew, without a doubt, was that a Holstein cow was born a Holstein cow and would remain a Holstein cow forever. He went to the trestle every day for the next week, but he never saw her there again. Just the boys, yelling and egging one another on into dives and cannonballs and gainers, frantic with energy, as if they could already smell the decay on summer's breath and wanted to get in just one more jump. As if summer couldn't die as long as somewhere, someplace, there was a kid flying out from a trestle, rotating heels overhead, back arc to meet the river.
Thank you.
August fuhr oft stundenlang ziellos mit dem Fahrrad herum. An den Landstraßen aus der Stadt hinaus standen Sonnenblumen, die ihren Höhepunkt gerade hinter sich hatten. Er strampelte an endlosen Reihen von ihnen vorbei, die schweren Köpfe hingen von den trockenen Stängeln, das Gelb wurde langsam braun, vereinzelt klafften Zahnlücken, wo Blütenblätter fehlten. An einem Nachmittag sah er Jugendliche von der Eisenbahnbrücke in den Fluss springen. Hauptsächlich Jungs in seinem Alter, in abgeschnittenen Jeans, Shorts, schlank und braun gebrannt. Aber ein Mädchen in einem gelben Badeanzug war auch dabei. Während August zusah, machte sie einen Salto vorwärts und kurz bevor sie eintauchte, die Hacken voran, den Rücken absolut gerade, hielt sie sich mit einer Hand die Nase zu, eine präzise, fast schon delikate Bewegung. Er spritzte kaum und sie tauchte ein kurzes Stück flussabwärts wieder auf. Ihre Arme blitzten auf, während sie gegen die Strömung ans Ufer schwamm. Als sie die Felsen hoch zurück auf die Brücke kletterte, verrutschte der Badeanzug hinten und die normalerweise verhüllte blasse Haut strahlte in der Sonne. Als sie wieder oben war, richtete sie den Stoff mit einem Greifen, Ziehen, Wackeln, das August den Atem verschlug. Sie war klein und ihr blondes Haar lag ihr in einem nassen Zopf auf dem Rücken. Einer der Jungs sagte etwas zu ihr, was August nicht verstand, und dann schubste sie ihn von der Brücke und lachte, bevor sie selbst hinterher sprang. August war stundenlang in der Spätsommersonne herumgefahren, das T-Shirt klebte ihm am Rücken und er wusste, dass eine andere, bessere Version von ihm einfach an der Brücke hochgeklettert wäre, sich den anderen Jungs vorgestellt und dem Mädchen beiläufig zugenickt hätte, das T-Shirt abgestreift und dann einen Salto rückwärts in ein neues Leben gemacht hätte, in dem er problemlos Freundschaften schloss. Aber er fuhr weiter. Es gab eine Enge, wo die Berge von beiden Seiten näher an den Fluss herankamen. Ihm war schon aufgefallen, dass hier immer der Wind wehte, weil die Luft sich zwischen den Hängen hindurch nach unten zwängte. Er senkte den Kopf und strampelte. Sandkörner prasselten auf seine Wangen ein, bis er durch das Tal war und sich ein Tal vor ihm öffnete, weit offene Weiden und Heufelder, die noch grün waren, weil sie mit Flusswasser berieselt wurden. Keine Milchkuh weit und breit, nichts als rote und schwarze Angusrinder, die mit der Schnauze im Gras dastanden, manchmal an den Zaun gingen, aber glotzäugig zurückschreckten, sobald sein Fahrrad zu nahe kam. Diese Haltungsweise hatte eine gewisse Würde, die im Stall fehlte. Diese Rinder waren noch nie zwischen Stahlrohre gezwängt gewesen, hatten nicht still vor sich hingestanden und geschissen, während die Melkmaschine ihnen an den Zitzen saugte. Sie lebten ihr Leben, so kurz es auch war, draußen bei Wind und Wetter, konnten weitgehend frei umherziehen, bis sie natürlich irgendwann in Lastwagen getrieben und zum Schlachthof gefahren wurden. Ein langes, eintöniges Leben voller Zwänge und geschwollener Euter oder ein kürzeres in relativer Freiheit, das allerdings mit einer unausweichlichen Phase der Panik und Verwirrung endete, das gab einem zu denken. Natürlich waren Kühe keine Menschen, aber August wusste, dass einer wie Bob jetzt gerade von der Eisenbahnbrücke hechten würde, statt hier draußen alleine auf seinem Fahrrad zu sitzen und den blöden Kühen zuzugucken. Er hätte das Mädchen mit dem gelben Badeanzug kennengelernt. Er hätte sich zweimal geprügelt, dann wären die anderen Jungs seine Freunde gewesen. Das, was ihn den Dolch in Brent Gidley hatte rammen lassen und ihn ins Gefängnis gebracht hatte, war genau dasselbe, was ihm auch Respekt und Angst und Freundschaft in Ausmaßen eingebracht hatte, die für August immer unerreichbar waren. August fragte sich, ob diese Eigenschaften, was auch immer sie sein mochte, angeboren war oder ob man sie entwickeln konnte. Denn eins wusste er todsicher: Eine Holsteinkuh wird als Holsteinkuh geboren und bleibt ihr Leben lang eine. Die ganze nächste Woche fuhr er jeden Tag zur Brücke, sah das Mädchen dort aber nie wieder. Nur die Jungs, die brüllten, sich voller wilder Energie zu Kopfsprüngen, Arschbomben und Saltos anfeuerten, als könnten sie schon den Verfall im Atem des Sommers riechen und wollten vorher noch ein letztes Mal springen, als würde der Sommer nicht sterben, solange noch irgendwo ein Kerl von der Brücke sprang, die Hacken über den Kopf wirbeln ließ und den Rücken dem Fluss entgegenreckte.
Thank you, Jakob. Callan, I really like this passage. I think it's one of many moments in which August feels that divide between the person he wants to be and the person he is. And I think that, of course, is part of growing up, that you wish you would act differently and something is holding you back. At the same time, I think in this passage, he's really concerned with place. He seems to think, like many young people, that the place you come from, in a way, determines who you are. And I wondered if you could say something more about that. I mean, you told us earlier about the background with 9/11 and many young men enrolling in the military. So that's also, an area, rural areas of the U.S. Young people have kind of limited prospects. So I wondered if you could say something about this belief that August has, that his place of origin, or the place he finds himself in or at in that moment, kind of limits him in a way.
Yeah, I still believe to a large degree that the place you come from affects the person you become, either in opposition or embracing wherever that place may be. I mean, there's no way that it can't. Just like your family, for instance. determines or has some degree of determination on who you will become, either again in opposition of your growing up or embracing that. So I mean, the place I think will always be a big part of the writing I do. I at this point can't write a story, for instance, set in a place that I don't have a pretty good understanding of. The place is often, sort of an additional character to the things I write, which I don't think is unusual. Most writers, I feel like, have some degree of that as well, whether their place is New York or Montana. It affects the characters' lives in so many different ways. And I think maybe some people would like to believe that where they came from doesn't affect who they are as an adult, but I would probably disagree with that. There's no way it can't affect who you are.
Right. Callan, I would like to ask you many more questions, but I think we're running out of time, and I want to switch to the app because there are so many questions already from the audience. And I think, like Marcus reminded you, there's this sli.do Slido. You can then add the hashtag America House, but we already have quite a few. So if you have a few more minutes for us, I would like to read them to you. One is, you mentioned the term New West. How do you think this concept is different from the traditional West? And how does it affect the American social landscape?
Yeah, so this is something I think about a lot. New West. So in a very specific example, the town I live in, Livingston, Montana, small town, close to Yellowstone Park. I would say, over the years, primary source of income there, ranching, the railroad was a big factor, that sort of thing. Lately, however, it's become this place that people want to live, and so, everyone who can, for instance, sell their small, modest home in San Jose, California, and move to Montana, and they can buy themselves, a mini ranch, and then rent out, part of that, their extra home on Airbnb or whatever. It's creating this sort of landscape where the average person who, say, may be work like a service job, or like me, a fishing guide, can no longer afford to own a home in this small town. And then that creates this like labor shortage. People that would work a service job can no longer live there. So the restaurants are having a hard time staying open. This sort of thing is happening all over in the West. And this particular thing, for instance, just, unaffordability of housing is one element that's going to face the West moving forward, in addition to water, which is something that many places in the dry West that are increasing in population are going to have to figure out a way to deal with water shortages. So these are just a couple different things that come to mind immediately when I think of how the West is changing and what it means to be in the West. I mean, in the West now, your main problem is less likely to be, for instance, dying of exposure. You're more likely, a main problem in your life is going to be being unable to find housing. So that sort of shift in terms of like what is a main concern for people's lives in these areas. Survival, not as much. Being able to flourish, definitely. Yeah.
Someone wants to know, without spoiling anything, can you share your inspiration for the character June and why you felt she was important for this story?
There's no direct inspiration for June, at least in terms of like my own personal life, but I think most people kind of at this early age, early teens, mid-teens, probably remember having this kind of awkward infatuation with someone that they barely knew, or you know, and not knowing how to approach that person. I think this is a pretty universal feeling for that time of life. Kind of your first sense of being attracted to someone sexually, and all of the various confusing emotions that raises.
Another member of the audience wants to know, have many of your friends or family from rural Montana read the novel, and what was their impression on the picture you paint? Is it accurate? I don't know if you have family in Montana.
Most of my friends live in Montana, and I will say that not many of my friends, some of them have read my book, but most of my friends I don't have a lot of friends that are writers and readers tremendously. I mean, my friends do read, but anyway, yeah, the friends that I have that have read the book, I think they've appreciated it. I don't feel like I've misrepresented or inflated or the opposite of inflated any sort of aspects of Montana life. I feel like I've tried to represent it as well as I can, you know, based upon the reality I know. So yeah, I think the friends of mine who have read it, you know, I've used some of their names, you know, part of their names. That's something I do when I'm naming characters. I steal like a last name from one friend and the first name of a different friend, so they kind of feel like they're lived in names, you know. So my friends like that. If they read it, they're like, "Oh, you used my last name."
Another question, let me see, about place. Why did you choose to compare rural Midwest with the rural West instead of the usual urban-rural contrast?
Yeah. I guess I've never thought about it that way, but there is a little bit of a difference between the rural Midwest and the rural West. A lot of similarities as well. But you know, when I moved from the rural Midwest, for instance, to the rural West, something about the American West just seems like characters can kind of expand. They're something about, it's like, you know, your fish in the fish tank thing. Your fish can only grow as large as the tank that it's in. Montana, vast area. People's kind of personalities, I feel like, sometimes flourish. So when I moved to Montana, I was just confronted by all of these sort of eccentric people that I don't remember growing up around in the rural Midwest. I'm sure they were there, but it just seems like something about Montana. It just allows people to get a little weird, which is great for coming characters. Yeah.
And Jonathan wants to know, what's your writing process like? Do you write lots of drafts? Is there a long gestation period?
I'm very much still trying to figure it out. So I don't write in the summer much at all. I fishing guide every day. It's kind of a full-time thing, long hours. And so I do that from March to October. And then from the rest of the year, I try to write pretty seriously every day. And I tend to write pretty quickly. First draft comes out, it's usually not very good. So most of the writing for me is rewriting, which I don't love, but I feel like I'm writing when I'm writing a first draft, and then everything after that just feels like work. But that's probably the most important part of it, I've come to determine. So.
And one last question, I think this is a great way to end our conversation. You said that August is a character that has been present in your work for quite some time. Do you think you will come back to him in the future?
I've thought about it. I think for my next book, I want it to be something completely different, but I could see myself returning to the character further down the line. It's a character that is close to me, you know, that will always be in my head. So I think I'll probably at least write more stories from his perspective.
We look forward to that, Callan, and to knowing more about August. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time and for your patience and sharing your thoughts. Callan Wink is the author of August, which came out in 2020. Big Sky Country is the German translation. Thank you so much, Jakob Immervoll, for your interpretation of the German version. And thank you to our audience in the theater and online. And Callan, all the best and happy writing.
Thank you so much for having me. Good evening. I appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening to you too. Bye-bye.